They chose the wrong week, the wrong ground, the wrong weather. And by the time Russian commanders understood all three of those mistakes, their armored assault in eastern Ukraine had already become a field of abandoned machines, sinking slowly into April mud, while Ukrainian artillery adjusted fire on each one in turn. This is the story of what happened when a Russian mechanized push met a Ukrainian defensive plan that had been built around the most reliable weapon system available in eastern Ukraine every spring: the ground itself. And this is what it cost Russia to learn, once again, that the April thaw does not care about operational timelines. The Ukrainian defensive preparation for this engagement began weeks before the first Russian vehicle crossed the line of departure. Ukrainian military engineers operating along the eastern front had been conducting detailed terrain analysis of the sectors most likely to be used as Russian assault axes when conditions appeared to improve after winter. The logic was straightforward. Russian commanders would see the surface of the fields drying in the early April sun and assess that the ground had firmed sufficiently for armored movement. Ukrainian engineers knew that assessment would be wrong. In eastern Ukraine, the spring thaw is not a surface phenomenon. The top layer of soil dries and firms relatively quickly once temperatures rise above freezing during daylight hours. But the subsurface, the layer that sits below the first 20 to 30 centimeters of surface soil, remains saturated with meltwater for weeks after the surface appears solid. A field that looks trafficable from a vehicle commander's cupola, or from a drone at altitude, or from a satellite image, may have a subsurface that will not support the ground pressure of a T-72 or a BMP for more than a few meters of travel off a hard-surfaced road. Ukrainian engineers know this. They have worked this terrain. They have databases of historical soil saturation patterns, cross-referenced against temperature records and precipitation data that allow them to predict with reasonable confidence which fields and which route corridors will remain soft-bottomed through the first weeks of April, even when the surface appears dry. That knowledge was the foundation of the defensive plan for this engagement. The plan had two active components and one passive component. The passive component was the terrain itself. The subsurface saturation that Ukrainian engineers had assessed would hold for the operational period. The first active component was deliberate mining of the hard-surfaced route corridors that connected the Russian assembly area to the Ukrainian defensive line, the routes that Russian vehicles would be forced to use if the off-road terrain proved impassable. Ukrainian sapper teams moved during the night preceding the expected assault, working under drone overwatch that monitored for Russian observation, and placed anti-vehicle mines along the route shoulders and at the points where tracked vehicles would most likely attempt to transition off-road. The mines were emplaced with the specific intent of channeling Russian vehicles onto the fields rather than destroying them on the roads. The roads were controlled. The fields were the killing ground. The second active component was the deliberate destruction of a series of small irrigation channels and drainage culverts that ran along the margins of the primary approach fields. These structures, built decades ago to manage agricultural water flow, had been keeping the subsurface water table lower than it would otherwise have been even under spring thaw conditions. Ukrainian engineering teams breached them in the 48 hours before the assault, allowing the water they had been draining to spread into the soil of the approach fields. In agricultural terms, what Ukrainian engineers did was flood the drainage system of the fields that Russian armor would need to cross. They turned fields that were borderline trafficable into fields that were definitively impassable, without laying a single mine on them, without building a single obstacle, without making any change that would be visible from Russian observation positions or overhead imagery. The trap was invisible, and Russian commanders drove their armor straight into it. The assault began in the early morning hours, as Russian armored assaults almost always do, using darkness to cover the initial movement, hoping to reach Ukrainian positions before full daylight, gave Ukrainian observers and drone operators the visibility they needed to engage effectively. The column moved on the hard-surfaced approach roads initially, making good time, the vehicle commanders likely confident in the operation. The mines on the route shoulders had not yet been triggered. Russian sappers had conducted route clearance. But the clearance had focused on the road surface itself and had not extended fully to the margins where Ukrainian teams had concentrated their emplacement. The first vehicle lost to the mines was a mine-clearing vehicle that was leading the column's advance. The armored roller system it was pushing hit a mine cluster on the route shoulder when the driver adjusted to pass a pothole in the road surface. The vehicle was disabled but not destroyed. It blocked the column's advance on the hard surface. The following vehicles, facing the blocked route and under pressure to maintain momentum, began to transition off the road onto the adjacent fields. The first T-72 that moved onto the field made it approximately 40 meters before its left track began to break the surface crust. Another 30 meters and the vehicle was visibly settling, the subsurface giving way under the 46-ton ground pressure load, the tracks finding no solid base to push against. The driver increased power. The track spun. The vehicle sank further. Within 2 minutes of transitioning off the road, the tank was immobilized. Not by any weapon, not by any Ukrainian action, but by the ground that Ukrainian engineers had spent weeks preparing to receive exactly this vehicle in exactly this condition. Behind it, other vehicles were making the same transition. Some tried different lines across the field, hoping to find firmer ground. The subsurface saturation was uniform. Ukrainian engineers had been accurate in their assessment. Each vehicle that moved more than 50 meters off the road began to bog. Within 20 minutes of the column's attempted off-road transition, Ukrainian drone operators watching from altitude were observing what looked less like an armored assault and more like a parking lot where every vehicle had simultaneously suffered a mechanical failure. 11 tracked vehicles immobilized on the fields, 3 more disabled on the road by the mining effect. The column had ceased to function as a mobile assault force. It had become a collection of static targets. Ukrainian artillery, which had been on standby with pre-registered fire missions against the approach routes and the adjacent fields, began to engage. The fire missions did not need significant adjustment. Ukrainian artillery crews had spent the preceding days registering against the exact ground where Russian vehicles were now sitting. The first adjusting rounds walked onto the immobilized vehicles within minutes. Ukrainian FPV drone teams, launching from concealed positions several kilometers back from the front line, were airborne and approaching the engagement area as the artillery adjustment fires landed. What followed was a systematic destruction of a Russian armored force that could not move, could not maneuver, and could not effectively return fire. Immobilized tanks can still fire their main guns, but without mobility, they cannot achieve the fire and move tactics that armored vehicles use to survive in a contested environment. They sit, they fire, and they absorb incoming fires until they are destroyed or their crew abandons them. Several Russian crews attempted to fight from their immobilized vehicles. Ukrainian anti-tank missile teams engaged those vehicles at ranges that the tank crews, unable to maneuver, could not effectively contest. The tanks that attempted to fire back, traversing their turrets to engage Ukrainian positions, were targeted first by FPV drones that approached from the rear and flanks, angles that the stationary tanks could not easily cover. Russian infantry dismounted from the APCs and IFVs that were also struggling in the mud and attempted to establish a defensive perimeter that might allow recovery vehicles to reach the immobilized tanks. Ukrainian infantry, positioned in prepared fighting positions along the forward edge, engaged the dismounted Russian soldiers with direct fire. The ground between the Russian vehicles and the Ukrainian positions was open, flat, and completely exposed, a killing ground that Ukrainian defensive planners had selected precisely because it offered no cover to a dismounted force moving across it. The recovery attempt failed. Russian engineering vehicles that moved up the hard-surfaced route to attempt vehicle recovery were themselves engaged by Ukrainian fires before they could reach the immobilized tanks. The route was covered by Ukrainian anti-tank systems and FPV drones operating under the continuous observation of Ukrainian drone teams that had been tracking every vehicle in the Russian formation since the assault began. By the time Russian commanders at higher echelons understood the full extent of what had happened, that an armored assault force had been effectively destroyed not by a prepared Ukrainian defensive position, but by the ground itself, with Ukrainian fires completing what the mud had started. The engagement was over. The fields held the evidence, tracked vehicles, sitting at odd angles where they had sunk into the softened subsurface. Others burned where Ukrainian fires had caught them while they were already immobile. Crew hatches open on vehicles whose crews had decided that the mud offered better survival odds than staying inside a burning vehicle. Now let us examine precisely what this cost Russia. The armored vehicles lost in this engagement represent a material investment that Russia is finding increasingly difficult to replace. The The T-72B3M and T-80 variants involved in this assault carry replacement costs of $3.5 to $4.5 million USD each under current Russian production conditions. Conditions constrained by Western sanctions, component shortages, and the accumulated strain of 2+ years of wartime production at elevated rates. With a minimum of 9 main battle tanks destroyed or irreparably damaged in this engagement, the tank loss alone represents $31 to $40 million in replacement cost. The BMP and BTR platforms immobilized and subsequently destroyed add an additional $12 to $18 million at current replacement values. Supporting engineering vehicles, including the mine-clearing platform disabled in the initial phase of the assault, add $3 to $5 million. Total direct material loss, conservatively between $46 million and $63 million USD, in a single morning, against a defensive operation that cost Ukraine primarily the ammunition expended and the engineering materials used in the preparatory phase, a fraction of the loss inflicted. The asymmetry of that exchange ratio is the number that matters most in any analysis of this conflict's trajectory. Russia spent $46 to $63 million in irreplaceable military hardware to gain zero ground, zero tactical advantage, and zero operational progress. Ukraine spent a fraction of that figure to eliminate an entire Russian armored formation from the order of battle for this section of the front. This exchange ratio, repeated across engagements along the Eastern Front, is the arithmetic of attrition that is slowly but consistently degrading Russian combat power faster than Russian industrial and manpower systems can regenerate it. Russia's tank production, even at elevated wartime rates, cannot keep pace with losses of this magnitude sustained at this frequency. The T-62s and T-55s being pulled from storage to supplement production are not equivalent replacements. They are older, less capable, more vulnerable to the anti-armor systems Ukraine operates. Sending them forward does not solve the capability gap. It fills the gap temporarily with platforms that will be lost faster than the platforms they replaced. The manpower losses in this engagement compound the material calculation. Russian tank crews represent years of specialized training. Operating a T-72 under combat conditions, managing the fire control systems, the mobility systems, the crew coordination required to fight effectively is a skill that takes years to develop at a professional level. The crews lost in these immobilized and subsequently destroyed vehicles were not all novices. Some of them were experienced contract soldiers with multiple deployments. Replacing their skills with mobilized conscripts who have received weeks of training is not equivalent. It produces crews who can operate vehicles in basic terms, but who lack the tactical judgment, the system's proficiency, and the crew cohesion that experienced crews develop over years. Russian commanders ordered this assault because the surface of the fields looked dry from their observation posts and from the drone imagery they were reviewing. Ukrainian engineers had spent weeks ensuring that the surface appearance would be deceiving. The trap required no exotic technology, no advanced weapon system, no capability that Ukraine had to develop specifically for this engagement. It required terrain knowledge, engineering skill, patience, and the understanding that in early April in eastern Ukraine, the ground itself is a weapon if you know how to use it. Ukrainian sappers, Ukrainian artillery crews, Ukrainian FPV operators, Ukrainian infantry in prepared positions. Each of them did their part in an engagement that was decided in large measure before it began. Russia pushed forward. The mud stopped them. Ukraine finished the work. The fields in eastern Ukraine are still soft. The drainage channels are still breached. The surface still looks passable from a distance. And Ukrainian engineers are still watching, still updating their terrain assessments, still preparing for the next column that Russian commanders will send forward when they look at the fields and decide, incorrectly, that the ground is finally ready. Ukraine waits, Ukraine prepares, Ukraine wins. Step back from the tactical detail and consider what this engagement reveals about the current state of the conflict at the operational level. Because the significance extends beyond the vehicles lost and the ground not taken. Russian operational planning along the Eastern Front is constrained by a fundamental intelligence problem. Russian commanders know that Ukrainian defensive lines exist. They know approximately where those lines are. They have drone imagery and satellite data that tells them what the terrain looks like from above. What they systematically fail to account for, and what Ukrainian defenders have learned to exploit, is the gap between how terrain appears and how terrain performs under the specific conditions of a given operational moment. The April thaw in eastern Ukraine is not a secret. It happens every year. It has happened every year throughout the history of warfare on this terrain. The seasonal mud period, known historically as Rasputitsa, the time without roads, has been a factor in military operations in this region for centuries. Russian military doctrine acknowledges it. Russian operational planning is supposed to account for it. And yet, in this engagement, Russian commanders assessed that the ground was ready and sent their armor forward onto fields that Ukrainian engineers had specifically prepared to be impassable. The failure is not a failure of doctrine. It is a failure of ground truth, the inability to know, with sufficient precision, whether a specific field on a specific day is trafficable or not. Russian commanders looking at drone imagery of fields with dry-looking surfaces made an assessment. Ukrainian engineers who had been monitoring the actual soil conditions, who had deliberately manipulated the drainage systems to worsen those conditions, who had records of historical soil saturation in that specific area. They knew that assessment was wrong, and they built a defensive plan around that knowledge advantage. This is intelligence as a force multiplier. Not intelligence in the sense of intercepted communications or satellite imagery, but environmental intelligence, terrain knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how a specific piece of ground behaves under specific conditions. Ukrainian forces fighting in eastern Ukraine have built this knowledge over years of operating in this environment. Russian forces, many of whom have been rotated into this area from other regions, are operating on terrain they know less well, with soil condition databases they have not maintained, against a defender who knows the ground the way you only know it when you have lived and fought on it for years. The engineering work that enabled this trap deserves specific recognition. The Ukrainian sapper teams who breached the drainage channels worked at night, under drone overwatch, in cold April conditions, on ground that was itself soft and difficult to move across. They were not using sophisticated equipment. They were using hand tools, small explosive charges, and the knowledge of exactly which culverts and which channels to breach to maximize the water table rise in the fields they were targeting. The work was precise, physically demanding, and conducted under the constant risk of detection. The sappers who completed it, and who completed it without being observed by Russian forces, gave Ukrainian commanders the passive defensive advantage that made everything else possible. The FPV teams that operated against the immobilized vehicles deserve examination as well, because engaging immobile targets is technically simpler than engaging moving vehicles, but it is not without challenges. Russian vehicle crews that survived the initial immobilization and the first artillery adjustment fires were aware they were being targeted. They were firing their vehicle weapons at any observed Ukrainian position. They were attempting to lay smoke. Some were attempting to dismount and establish defensive positions around their vehicles. Ukrainian FPV operators engaged under those conditions, with active fire coming from the vehicles, with smoke reducing visibility, with crew-served weapons on several of the immobilized platforms, tracking drone sounds and attempting to engage. The operators who flew their drones into those conditions, who completed their attack runs through active defensive fire, were not operating in the simple environment of a vehicle that doesn't know it's being targeted. They were operating against an alerted fighting target. That is a harder task. That they completed it is a reflection of their training and their experience. The artillery coordination that supported the engagement also reflects Ukrainian capability development that has been built through years of operational experience. Ukrainian artillery units operating in eastern Ukraine have developed precise fire mission procedures for exactly this type of engagement. Multiple stationary targets spread across a wide area, requiring careful sequencing to avoid ammunition waste and to prevent smoke from early impacts obscuring later targets. The fire sequencing used in this engagement, working from the edges of the immobilized vehicle cluster inward so that smoke from destroyed outer vehicles blew away from rather than toward remaining targets, reflects the kind of tactical detail that only experienced artillerymen who have worked this specific terrain and these specific conditions develop. Russian forces, meanwhile, were attempting to conduct a recovery operation under fire. The engineering vehicles that moved up the approach roads to attempt vehicle extraction were themselves entering a contested environment where Ukrainian fires were active and where Ukrainian drone operators had clear observation of every vehicle moving on the approach roads. The fact that those recovery attempts failed, that the engineering vehicles were engaged and driven back before they could reach the immobilized tanks, reflects the completeness of Ukrainian fire's dominance over the engagement area during this period. Russia committed recovery assets to save equipment that was already lost, and those recovery assets became additional losses. The total picture of this engagement, viewed from the perspective of operational art, is a demonstration of what a well-prepared defense can accomplish against an attacker who commits to an approach without adequate ground truth intelligence. Russia sent armor onto ground it believed was passable. Ukraine had spent weeks ensuring that belief was wrong. Russia's armor became static targets. Ukraine's fires destroyed them. Russia's recovery assets were destroyed when they attempted to intervene. And at the end of it, the ground that Russian forces had been trying to cross was still in Ukrainian hands, with the additional benefit of the burning wrecks of a Russian armored formation scattered across the fields as a visible indicator of what awaits the next formation that attempts the same approach. The exchange ratio of this engagement, $46 to $63 million in Russian material losses against a fraction of that in Ukrainian expenditure, is not an anomaly. It is characteristic of what happens when a technically and tactically superior defensive preparation meets an attacker who has not adequately accounted for the conditions it is entering. Russia will attempt to repair this. Russian engineers will work to identify and seal the drainage breaches that Ukrainian sappers created. Russian commanders will order more detailed terrain reconnaissance before committing armor. Russian operational planners will update their soil condition assessments and wait for the ground to firm further before launching the next assault. And while they do all of that, Ukrainian defenders will be watching, updating their own terrain assessments, identifying the next approach corridor that Russian commanders will consider when conditions appear to improve. Pre-registering fires, moving engineering teams, preparing the ground. Because in eastern Ukraine in April, the ground is still on Ukraine's side. That is not a metaphor. It is a tactical reality. Ukrainian engineers spent weeks making it so. Ukrainian artillery crews trained for years to exploit it. Ukrainian FPV operators flew into active fire to complete it. Ukrainian infantry held the line while all of it unfolded in front of their positions. The fields in eastern Ukraine, seen from above, look like farmland. From ground level, standing in a fighting position on the Ukrainian defensive line, they look different. They look like ground that Ukrainian defenders know in ways that Russian attackers do not, ground that Ukrainian commanders have mapped, analyzed, and prepared over years of fighting for every meter of it. Russia sent armor across those fields. The fields gave Ukraine the first victory. Ukrainian fires delivered the rest. Ukraine prepares, Ukraine defends, Ukraine wins.